Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming on this Saturday afternoon for a philosophy conference. That's really admirable. We have a really interesting speaker today, which came all the way from Germany. I have the pleasure today to present to you Professor Monika Kirloskar-Steinbach from the University of Konstanz. She currently serves as the Vice President of the Society of Intercultural Philosophy of Germany, and also she is the editor of the international peer-reviewed Journal of World Philosophies. She's herself, of course, a professor of philosophy. And before we start the presentation, I would like to use this opportunity as well to announce the second publication in the series that with Professor Morisato we're editing, Studia Philosophica, which actually in a funny way coincides with the lecture today. It's called The Death of the Soul, Critical Essays on the University. And we have Countering Academic Domination. So for all of you who are interested in reading more, please look it up. And without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Steinbach to begin her lecture.
Okay. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about academic domination and how academic domination affects the nature of cross-cultural knowledge which is produced. What I'm going to try to show you here is that cross-cultural philosophy finds itself in a relationship of dependency with mainstream philosophy. And the latter seems to set the terms of participation of the former. This asymmetrical relationship not only impacts the way cross-cultural philosophy is integrated into the discipline, it also deeply affects the manner in which cross-cultural philosophical knowledge is produced. I'm going to call this the monological orientation, and to offset or to do away with, remedy this monological orientation, I'm going to look at Nishida Kitarō's reflections on the place of dialogue, and then conclude that some of his reflections do indeed seem to be able to counter academic domination. For you as a Japanese audience, it would be interesting to know that the Japanese cultural theorist Inaga Shigemi has commented that I think in 1889, if I'm not sure, but way back sometime around the 1890s, Indian philosophy and Chinese philosophy were introduced at the University of Tokyo to complement Western philosophy, but he comments or bemoans the lack of Japanese philosophy having been established as philosophy till today in the Japanese institutions, academic institutions. Okay, so, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the situation globally. Current structures of philosophical knowledge production propagate the belief that philosophical knowledge production is an activity specific only to certain contexts. By projecting academic philosophy as the only instance of philosophical wisdom, prevalent practices in the profession can be experienced as being dominating by those who for different reasons do not or cannot follow this projection. If you are familiar with debates in political philosophy, one way of saying what is happening here could be to say that those the other cross-cultural philosophy and the other traditions are being dominated by mainstream philosophy. There's a very specific notion of domination at play here. James Bowman, the political theorist, defines domination as people are dominated to the extent that others are able to deny them standing and statuses. Without such standing and statuses, one is more likely to experience the social domination of disempowered silence. Not only do these colleagues face continued charges that their work does not meet the strict conditions of philosophy in general, it is often said to be simply unphilosophical. In their experience, they are also subjected to arbitrary duties in one specific sense, Inclusion in the academy is generally tied up with the duty not to openly criticize or debunk the conventional understanding of philosophy, at least in teaching. The worry here seems to be that students should not be confronted with and confused by a possible plurality of different philosophical conceptual frameworks at this very crucial stage in the initiation process. Occasionally, when departments allow for courses on world philosophies, faculty is in general expected to use qualifiers in course titles like, for example, Asian philosophy, Indian philosophy, Japanese philosophy, African thought, Buddhist thought, wisdom traditions, etc. Only one philosophy is allowed to present itself without such qualifier. This is Euro-American philosophy, of course, without the qualifier used here. Although cross-cultural philosophers are equal members of the philosophical community, at least on paper, some of them experience the conditions of their membership as being highly asymmetrical. Whilst being sought out as duty bearers in this qualified sense, they do not, on account of their affiliation to cross-cultural philosophy, for example, be able to make equal claims on fellow members of the philosophical profession. Their degree of participation in epistemic practices is determined by other members who are better placed due to contingent reasons, for example, specialization in the particular research field. Thus, although the philosophical community claims to place itself within a common space of reasons and purports to be united by the aim of knowledge sharing, it ascribes to some members at least an asymmetrical participatory status. Only some members, especially those with research interests in the dominant tradition, have the normative power to bestow and change the normative status of others, that is, those with research interests in cross-cultural philosophy. Further, only they can determine which culturally biased reasons will be considered to be philosophical reasons. Moreover, the flip side of philosophy's self-projection is that it has, through time, rendered non-European traditions into its epistemic dependence. As a consequence, many specialists and practitioners of these traditions clamor for this instance to finally bestow the seal of true philosophy on them. They hope that their comparative work will be conferred this status. Comparativists remain cast in their roles as informants who can be beckoned to serve the interests of the philosophical community. In addition, cross-cultural philosophers are generally not consulted as epistemic agents in their own right, but merely as information sources when philosophers specializing in the Euro-American tradition deem it fit. The former are not regarded as independent epistemic agents whose lines of philosophical investigation could run parallel to those of philosophy. Rather, they become objects of information, sometimes knowledge, to be consulted at will occasionally. If this is indeed the case, relations of domination between philosophy and cross-cultural philosophy apparently become a necessary condition in the generation of systematic epistemic injustice. The special context in which philosophizing takes place harms cross-cultural philosophers in their capacity as knowers and subjects of independent knowledge claims. Professional philosophy's demands render them silent and or do not allow them to make knowledge claims which they, under circumstances, would have. Such relations of domination are not only morally wrongful, as the literature on epistemic injustice shows us, they seem to seriously impede diversity in the profession too. Structures of knowledge production tend to push cross-cultural philosophers today to produce knowledge which does not stray away from the well-tread path and in general mimics what is identified as philosophical knowledge in the dominant tradition. Thus, cross-cultural philosophy's ability to implement so-called ideational diversity remains below par. Basically, they're working on the other traditions, but what they're producing is mimicking the main tradition. That is what the point I'm trying to make here. But is there any remedy to this so-called monological orientation at all? In the next section, I will broadly sketch a possible way out. I will then use the deliberations of the so-called Kyoto School to flesh out these ideas. Finally, I will make the claim that the thoughts of Nishida and his followers can in some ways be implemented to curtail the domination currently at play in professional philosophy. In fact, as we shall soon see, it can be used to make an argument for world philosophy. So, what could we expect from an approach which can counter the domination currently present in professional philosophy? To begin with, we can reasonably expect that it is not completely right of philosophy itself, because meaning making is an integral part of being human, regardless of where we are and what we do. We seem to make meaning and want to make meaning with others. Instead, being aware of the ambivalence found in the process of meaning making, it would make space for breaking away from the ossified meaning making practices. To make meaning with others, we need to share a common conceptual repertoire with them. Yet our own way of explicating these resources and making sense of them with other co-members can render this process hegemonic and authoritarian. This happens when we begin to take habituated ways of understanding as the sole way of understanding a phenomenon, and in the process we lose our ability at changing intellectual perspectives and dialogic roles. We do not accept other contrary perspectives emanating from other communities, and are not ready to switch roles from an epistemic authority to a learner. We then attempt to structure the field of meanings with our co-members in such a way that contrary meanings are excluded or marginalized. Although the approach we are searching for would account for the fact that such exclusionary effects can at times seem to make our meaning-making efforts less complicated and quicker, it would be equally attentive to the price these exclusionary attempts have. They force us to become unfree because we cut away other ways of understanding our own place in the world. The approach we seek would open up a space upon a common practice which allows members to step back and reflect upon why they are following a rule, call it in question, and negotiate the terms of its modification with other members. It would make room for the idea that constitutionally free societies have to come up with ways which must guarantee the freedom of their members in all their dealings with their co-members, as also with other living beings. Applied to our context, members of such a society would use the term philosophy as a general term to signify the general human practice of meaning-making about the world and one's specific place in it. Our own place in the world today demands this stance. We cannot simply fall back on our national communities because they don't seem to make meanings which we need in the international context. This practice is not unique to any specific context, but as James Tully, the political theorist, says, it changes in the course of human conversation. Although it can take different forms in the context in which it is embedded, we can slowly build up our practical skills such that we begin to see the family resemblances across these specific contexts. This skill is built up through sustained practice in which intellectual humility guides an engaged study of these contexts. In the course of time, we will, through such practice, be able to develop our normative abilities, which allows us to use this term to signify contexts, even though the term's use in the specific context goes against the own community's habituated, customary use of it. In such a case, the person engaging with this digressing context will do her best to develop the ability of deep empathetic listening. What is deep empathetic listening? Basically that you're paying attention to the other person through all your senses, using different perspectives, being attentive to the person embedded in a particular context. And through this multi-sensorial, multi-perspectival attentiveness to the other person, one learns not only to cognitively understand the other, but simultaneously learns to develop an emotional awareness as to why the other person is propagating such a view. One learns to basically switch perspectives and to see the situation from the other side. As Jim Tully says, this mode of being in the world with others rules out seeking to master the other. If such an encounter is successful, this person would find herself questioning her hitherto understanding of philosophy. In a further step, she would begin to reason with members of one's own philosophical community such that their extant definitions of philosophy should be extended and modified because, for example, there are certain experiences in human life which they are simply unable to track because they have one particular conceptual framework, and experiences are always being generated differently and to some extent new. The wider community, for its part, appreciates that its members inherit a past and transform it into an articulation of a lived experience, and in that very act of retrieval and reinvention, fashion a very distinctive understanding of how it all hangs together and why. Through this critical attitude of being in the world, these members increase the possible ways of being in the world for the community as a whole. And inasmuch as they, in these instances, attempt to make meaning of these experiences, they equally add to different meanings of what it means to be free. Thus, again, Tully, the horizons of our practices and forms of thought get shifted in such intercultural encounters to reveal other possible ways of being in the world. Allow me to flesh out these ideas using some deliberations from the so-called thinkers of the Kyoto School. Nishida Kitarō would draw attention to the dialectical relationship between individuals and their communities. Although individuals are deeply influenced by the cultural patterns of their communities, they too, as Brett Davis says, can counter-determine the cultures in which they live. Human beings are neither the free-floating, atomistic, unencumbered individuals critiqued by communitarian thinkers, nor are they being completely predetermined by their native communities. They are deeply rooted in certain cultural traditions and yet can potentially critique aspects of the very roots which bind them to these communities. Two presuppositions seem to be at play here. The individual is aware of her communal binding and has the ability to question this binding. She would feel motivated in a particular situation to do so because for whatever reason, the individual is not happy with the status quo and seeks to break away from it. To quote another philosopher from the Kyoto School, Ueda Shitsuteru's phrase, she does not experience her world as being one of infinite openness. Rather, she perceives herself as being trapped within the boundaries of a limited world. Now, one could argue that striking up a dialogue with people situated in different communities could get one out of this impasse. Depending on the specifics of a possible recalibration of the individual self-understanding, however, such a dialogue would lead to some deep repercussions on how the community perceives itself and its place in the world. Would such a dialogue not be risky for a community? Wouldn't this dialogical process, for instance, starkly undermine what makes them into a community in in the first place? If they simply are so busy dialoguing with other communities, wouldn't they risk losing their essential nature, their Japanness, their Indianness, their Germanness, whatever, if you will? Let us take on these issues by directing our attention to Nishida's place of dialogue. For our purposes, what is important here is that it sets up a relation between the people involved in it. The place of dialogue determines the individuation of the people involved. When two individuals meet in such a dialogue, they do not meet as representatives of their own traditions, but as, I'm quoting Brett Davis again, two focal points of the self-determination of their ultimate place, or universal of absolute nothingness, that is, as two uniquely creative elements of the creative world. I mean, to cut it down, they don't simply meet each other as two representatives of their communities. Nishida reasons that these individuals are not to be taken as particular instantiations of a universal of being, which predetermines who they are and what they are. Rather, the place of dialogue allows them to delve into the realm of absolute nothingness. Not only does this dialectical universal enable such a dialogue, it is also deeply freedom enhancing. It allows those involved in the dialogue to engage with and realize those parts of themselves which are not predetermined by their cultural nativistic, or political circumstances. This is possible because the place of dialogue is not the site of an affirmation of individual characteristics, but a place in which several possibilities in experiencing this absolute nothingness can be explored. To be able to fully explore these possibilities, however, individuals would have to consciously empty themselves of attributions which make them believe that they are self-contained, individual, distinctive selves. One way of such a radical cut would be to consciously free themselves from the authority of any pre-given tradition. The dialogue for this cut allows for this cut, since its place of nothingness is the non-reductive medium of dialectical interaction, says Brett Davis. So, what I'm trying to get at here is, I and thou, as we see according to Nishida in this understanding of a dialogue, co-emerge. They arise through the selves mutually individuating each other. In certain ways, the I and the thou bind each other inasmuch as they co-arise through the mutual experience of absolute nothingness. For this experience, however, it is pivotal to understand that the I we are talking about here is not a conventional I, but is one which is achieved through or after a process of discarding the non-self. It's basically you have to do a lot of work to get that I. Yeah? It is not an I the way we understand it. In Ueda Shizuteru's words, I am myself by not being myself. In German, in the original, he says, Ich bin, indem ich nicht bin, ich. Yeah? This is the seat of Nishida's action, intuition. That's the word he uses for it. From the community's perspective, there's little sense to hold back individual members and not allow them to engage in such a transformative dialogue. There seem to be several reasons for this. Firstly, the individuation of communities too depends on such a place, seems to depend on such a dialogue. It is doubtful whether a strong communal self-understanding of being a self-standing individual community can be developed further when there's a perceptible hiatus between this self-perception and the other's perception. Secondly, if communities consist of individual members who are instantiations of a dialectical universal of nothingness, it would follow that communities too are instantiations of such a universal, of course, with these instantiations being in flux. They are simply moving. They do not incorporate essential characteristics of a particular community, nation, or state. This means that both individuals and communities are not being perceived as self-contained habitats of individual or collective egos. Rather, they are being perceived as distinctive entities through their interaction with other individuals and groups. And yet, this interaction reveals the momentariness of such a distinctiveness. At every single point in time, there are several other possibilities of realizing the potentialities of this absolute nothingness, both for individuals and for communities. One sees one in the many and the many in the one continuously. Ethically speaking, individuals involved in the dialogue are also bound by a deep sense of responsibility for the other. The thou can arise only if the I supports her attempt to achieve freedom for the self as well as freedom from the I-ness of the self. To paraphrase Ueda Shizuteru again, I and thou arise when those involved in a dialogue alternate between the roles of a responsible host who talks and a responsible guest who listens, albeit being ready to take on the role of the host when necessary. This deep feeling for the other in one's own self allows one to recognize the alterity of the other. It arises after experiencing the deep recesses of one's own true self. Importantly, Nishida's understanding does not portend to tell oneself what to do, but how to be. To quote him, in short, absolutely good conduct is conduct that takes the actualization of personality at its goal, that is conduct that functions for the sake of the unity of consciousness. Now, if the dialogue sketched above promises to be conducive to the individual self-actualization, one could reason that society should demand of their members that they dialogue with each other For example, by issuing executive orders again and again till they begin dialoguing with each other. However, this reasoning would not jibe well with the understanding sketched here. The reason is that dialogue partners are keen to engage with each other because they have acutely experienced the shortcomings of their own current ways of being. This experience drives them to initiate a dialogue with those situated in their proximity. To quote Ueda Shitsuteru, they suffer from the closedness and dimly perceiving the wrongness of their ways, and for the sake of truth make the attempt to open themselves up. Thus, if the readiness to dialogue has to do with individual motivation, it is doubtful whether the commands of a society can effectuate such an individual motivation. Nevertheless, the subjective feeling of being unfree in a particular situation is not a rare phenomenon. Most of us have it at some point of our lives. For example, many epistemic agents situated in constitutionally free and pluralistic societies who try to live by the idea of human freedom inscribed in the discursive practices of their societies become acutely aware of how some relatively inane social encounters or practices of their society leave them feeling completely unfree. This subjective feeling arises mostly when they encounter people who are not socialized in the dominant social imaginary. In such encounters, the former sense that their conceptual apparatus comes up short. The encounter swings between mutual understanding and talking past each other. One lacks conceptual resources with which would allow one to find and stabilize the middle ground, which one glimpses through the interchange. Such experiences make some of these members wish for a better fit between their conceptual awareness and their social experience. As I see it, the dialogues sketched above would be one viable way in effectuating such a fit. In fact, it would highlight the need to empty essentializing attributions of the self from another perspective. If the person socialized in the dominant social imaginary attempts to in any way change her status quo, she would have to encounter the other person who is not socialized in this social imaginary on an equal footing, so that the transformation in the status quo can begin. If the latter's experience of power disparities overshadows this exchange, the chances are high that the exchange will be unable to yield the respected results. The latter's experience would, in this case, trigger off a chain reaction in which every individual reaction in the chain is a response to perceived power disparities, thus timing a more productive exchange. This spiral can be thwarted when the dominantly situated person makes clear that the exchange is not sought out for a confirmation of privilege, nor for intellectual posturing, nor for cultural appropriation, etc., but as an opportunity to learn. Only when the readiness to fearlessly hear is communicated well and understood can a fearless speaking be initiated. The first step at initiating a new practice of trust, it seems, will have to be taken up by the dominantly situated person. Since this new space opens up hitherto untried rules, both for both participants of the exchange, they will have to strive to keep the exchange going. For example, both would have to make room for each other to learn these roles through repeated usage and circumstances. Both will have to endeavor to maintain a middle ground between domination and subjection, because power disparities threaten to quickly seep into the exchange and snuff it out. In short, this would be an exchange of two embodied and situated persons acting in responsibility. Insights from the Kyoto School can be meaningfully applied to several aspects of this process. We can say, for example, that this middle ground can be created when the persons in the encounter alternate between the roles of a responsible guest and a responsible host. They allow each other room to transform their own selves through the process sketched above. The mutual respect they experience in this dialogue allows, or rather emboldens them, to take on the task of emptying conventional attributions of their own self, delve into their inner recesses, and discover the other person there, and emerge from this process with a deep experience of an I, which is not opposed to the thou, but is tied up through it with a deep sense of responsibility. Allow me to quote Nishida in Jim Heisig's translation here. There is no responsibility as long as the Tao that is seen at the bottom of the self is thought as the only self. Only when I am, I, by virtue of the Tao I harbor at my depths, do I possess an infinite responsibility at the bottom of my existence itself. This Tao can be a universal abstract Tao. This Tao cannot be a universal abstract Tao, nor the recognition of a particular object as a simple historical fact. The genuine ought is only conceivable in recognizing the other as a historical Tao within the historically conditioned situation of the I. In addition, it seems to become clear why the socially dominant person would have to take the first step in this process. At the beginning of the encounter, the socially dominant person, it seems, has more leverage to create a level playing field for both. To do so, however, she would have to signal that she is ready to empty her own ego of her social privilege. Only then can the process kick off, the presupposition being, of course, that even the other person intends to transform her own self. What begins as an encounter of social unequals then can end as an episode in which they experience themselves as socially situated moral beings who do not seek to dominate each other. The community itself has a vested interest in the success of such encounters, since the process as a whole promises to be freedom enhancing for its members. Through such encounters, the community can hone its practices of making freedom possible. If such encounters fare well, the community can incorporate their results into its epistemic practices. These encounters have the potential to break through the dominating effects of social practices and open up a fresh perspective on different levels. For example, such encounters may deliver a new leverage on the resources available within one's own tradition. An engagement with positions from other traditions, for instance, could ignite transformative experiences among those living under border conditions. These positions could help to home in on certain, perhaps underlit positions within one's own historical tradition. Relatedly, source material from other traditions could help foster the preferences, skills, and habits of mind which support the life of persistent curiosity and self-reflection. One could thus seek to inculcate in children, for example, a resistance to the epistemic ignorance bred in one's own knowledge community. The young or the inexperienced could have a larger spectrum of conceptual resources which they can resort to when they make meaning of themselves and their own places in the world. If such attempts at understanding oneself and one's place in the world are freedom enhancing, then constitutionally free societies apparently have a powerful reason to ascertain that these epistemic practices also make their way into these institutions which perceive themselves as being dedicated to meaning making. Within the academy, one such institution is professional philosophy. A longer analysis and a more sustained analysis of these thoughts would be necessary to show how they can, in the long run, contain the domination of professional philosophy. However, if my observations are plausible so far, they do seem to indicate that this process will be gradual, since, as mentioned above, such encounters depend on the motivation of individuals who seek to break free from their delimited worlds. They cannot be forced to change their ways by their communities. But there is reason to be optimistic. Some cross-cultural philosophers are already on their way to realizing their intercultural selves along the lines sketched above. These philosophers point out the shortcomings of using one single conceptual framework to map philosophies found in the world. They reason that philosophical concepts have their own provenance. They are generated in specific places for specific purposes. In philosophizing, people make a concerted attempt at understanding the world around them from their own vantage point at space and time. For this purpose, they make use of a conceptual vocabulary which has grown out of the humus of common customs and life forms. Philosophical activity thus cannot be meaningfully separated from the historical and corporal particularity of its epistemic subjects. To be able to understand local processes of meaning making better, we must, in their view, ground philosophical content in different traditions. In the light of one's own philosophical socialization in the dominant tradition, some proponents of this view urge one to respect difference. I'm quoting Helen Veran, who works on African traditions and African logic. She says, one must urge to respect difference. Before coming to these concepts, we must learn to recognize and value such difference, learn to refuse the step which requires a colonizing reduction to a shared category, and accept that we may not be committed to a common world, a conceptual world, she means. Only then can we begin to ground philosophical content in different traditions. The hope is that this respect would keep us away from all too easy generalizations about our own context. Only then, now I'm quoting two people working on Chinese philosophy, Henry Rosemont and Roger Ames, only then can we provide a means of giving the other their otherness without making them wholly other or equally mischievous, more simple-minded versions of our own selves, say Rosemont and Ames. These philosophers too would argue that the encounter with a person or text or material from other philosophical tradition should not be used as an occasion for intellectual posturing. Rather, those encultured in the dominant philosophical tradition should become deeply aware of their own contingent enculturation in it, take one step back from it, consciously seek to empty one's own predispositions, and then take one step forward towards the other tradition. Only then can one level the playing field for all concerned. These philosophers call for such a self-awareness because they are in general dissatisfied with the direction in which cross-cultural philosophy is in general going. They worry that without an emancipation from the clutches of Euro-American philosophy, we cannot stop searching for facile analogies in other intellectual traditions. We claim that we understand them, but all we do is simply find analogies to our own, so we're not moving. Yeah? Currently, there's a marked trend to compare philosophical positions separated in space and time by relating ideas, texts, etc. with one another. In their view, such comparisons stand on shaky grounds, since the standard of comparison is preset by the dominant philosophical tradition. One knows what one is searching for, yeah, right from the beginning. As a result thereof, the other position, text studied is mined for analogies which can in some manner relate to positions already established in the dominant tradition. Needless to say, this mode of inquiry does not enable the philosopher to dig deeper into conceptual, epistemological, and historiographical issues which are salient in reconstructing the other text, position, tradition in all its facets. The comparativist remains trapped within the confines of her own narrow philosophical horizon. Her questions generate answers to issues by which she is already seized and which are determined by her own cultural conditioning. This narrow mode of inquiry does not allow her to face the possibility that the other text, position, tradition at hand could require that she ask totally different philosophical questions. Given that non-Euro-American traditions, for example, have to be mirrored through the prism of familiarity to be cognized as philosophical traditions at all, traditions from near and afar will all begin to resemble each other, however remotely. So this is the idea of integrating them into philosophy, because they all look like mainstream philosophy. At best, their study will deliver missing parts of a mosaic of the philosopher's own intellectual familiarities. As a result, many world philosophies, views of the world stemming from different intellectual and cultural traditions, continue to be submerged under the weight of the dominant reading of mainstream philosophy. The authors I'm referencing here hope to usher in substantial changes in our study of non-Euro-American traditions. They seek to open up a space for a detailed study of world philosophy in order to correct this imbalance. Such a focused study of particular traditions would, they argue, in the long run, efface the negative effects wrought on these philosophies by the forces of colonialism and intellectual domination. So, to conclude, I began this paper with a description of how Euro-American philosophy has become a dominating force in the world of professional philosophy today and globally, not only in some parts of the world. Its domination does not seem to be restricted to North America and Europe, but as I said, it's global. The second section of the paper attempted to develop a theoretical account of how this domination can be contained. The third section used ruminations by some thinkers associated with the Kyoto School to flesh out the notion of an intercultural ethical encounter drawn in the previous section. It would go beyond the scope of this paper to think through how individual intercultural encounters can slowly lead to perceptible changes of the field. But I do think that there's much to learn from the thinkers of the Kyoto School in this regard. Their deliberations can lead us away from the impasse of a narrowly understood cross-cultural philosophy, which in my view renders world philosophies into pale imitations of one single tradition. I find their deliberations promising because they allow us to acknowledge our own historical standpoint as situated knowers. Once we stop locating our meaning-making attempts in an ethereal space somewhere above us, but ground them in our own spatio-temporal and socio-material contexts, we would get a more humbling view of our own activities. We would then become aware that our own philosophizing is contingent upon our own specific context and is not the sole way of interacting with the world. We would also realize that, like other tools, our epistemic resources need constant recalibration so that they can help us make sense of the world around us. Nishida's, Nishitani's, and Ueda's ruminations on the ethical dimension of an intercultural encounter can also be harnessed to make an argument for a study of world philosophies, such that these philosophies are studied in their own light and not simply as derivations of an original. Their thoughts can make a strong case as to why philosophers, especially those engaging with subjugated traditions, should consciously approach the other tradition through an attitude of ethical responsibility. This attitude would enable a philosopher to reconstruct the distinctive features of another philosophical tradition without simply finding more of oneself and what is familiar to one in the other tradition. I take their thoughts to mean that it is relatively futile to hold that one can sift through the intellectual traditions to arrive at an authentic Japaneseness, Germanness, Chineseness, Indianness, what have you. These attempts at condensing cultural essences of intellectual traditions will be in vain. These almost desperate attempts at halting the continual process of a human existence fail, for example, to do justice to the intermingling, to the intellectual borrowings through which cultural traditions arise. Arguably, Nishida's, Nishitani's, or Ueda's work can be implemented to show that comparison is not categorically unsound. In fact, a comparison with another position can serve as an impetus to creatively think through problems one faces in one's own work. But with their thoughts, we can make a strong argument for a sensitivity towards methodological issues in the study of world philosophical traditions, towards an intellectual decolonization, if you will. So, after giving you so much of theory, I can't leave you with so much of theory, so I'm going to leave you with a visual teaser. Rabindranath Tagore, if you know, this is the Indian poet and intellectual, won the Nobel Prize in 1913. He visited Japan in 1916 and was hosted by Tara Tomitaro. During his visit, he happened to meet Shimomura Kanzan and saw the latter's painting, a scene from the No play. As you must be knowing, this picture shows a blind sage who is able to see the sun with Buddha's mercy. Basically, he's seen the sun as a child, wants to see the sun again, cannot because he's turned blind, and with Buddha's mercy, he can see it again. This picture deeply impressed Tagore because it reminded him of a verse in the Indian Upanishads which appeals to God to lead one out of darkness. Rabindranath Tagore, when he was here, spent a lot of time collecting no masks. There are about more than 200 in the museum in India. Some of his own paintings were influenced by the no mask. This is his own portrait of an unknown lady. Arai Kanpo, a discipline of Daikan Yokohama, who was a discipline of the other very famous Japanese Okakura Kakuto, was sent to India to paint a panel for the similar panel, this panel for Tagore. The problem was the panel was too big to be painted in Japan. They couldn't transport it, so the painter had to go to Japan. Kakuzo had already befriended Tagore during his visit, to India in 1902. During his visits to India, he taught Rabindranath Tagore's nephews, two of them, Abanindranath Tagore and Nandanlal Bose, what was considered to be essential to art in Asia. He taught these two young people that Asian art differs in one crucial aspect from so-called Western art. In Asian art, you don't try to sort of depict nature the way you see it. You try to capture its essential nature so that it can sort of work to transform the self of the viewer. Nandanlal Bose, and for this purpose, the artist has to sort of find a fine balance between tradition and nature. Yeah. Nandanlal Bose and Arai Kanpo became very good friends. Arai taught Bose how to use the Japanese ink brush. Bose taught Arai the isometric perspective and symbolic drawing. Together, they developed new techniques and their artistic interventions. In this creative give and take of artistic styles, neither seems to have felt it necessary to impose one style on the other, nor bound down by what they individually got to the table. Here are some examples. So you'll see the Indian Nandanlal Bose takes on the Japanese ink technique and draws. The idea is to draw the Indian landscape using Japanese ink techniques. This is again influenced. This again Nandanlal Bose, influenced by the Japanese and Sino-Japanese tradition of depicting flowers. This is Arai Kanpo, who then goes to India. He's already studied Buddha studies in Japan, goes to India. There's a long extended debate on why the Buddha depicted in Japan differs from the one in India. There are long treatises on that, but basically the idea is that there are certain symbols of showing holiness in both these traditions, and they differ, and both of them debate as to why they differ. Arai Kanpo, when he comes back from India, begins depicting Buddha. Basically, it's then a synthesis of both these traditions. Yeah, again Indian. This is a bad copy. And this is, for example, Yokoyama Taikan. Yesterday, I walked somewhere near the Uno Park and I saw that there's a big memorial hall there. I mean, this is Yokoyama Taikan, who was there at the same time in India, many Japanese artists there. And if you will see, they're supposed to be Japanese women praying, but the scenery at the back, that's Indian. The flowers they're wearing are all Indian. So this is basically a synthesis of both. And both, all these artists are not claiming they are then showing essential Japanese reality or Indian reality. They're just showing what they think. The idea is to effectuate a self-transformation in those viewers. Okay, thank you.
Now we'll open a Q&A session. So please feel free to give any comments, any opinions, any questions you may have, and further inquire into this topic. So I hope we'll have a lively discussion.
Or if you've not understood something, please, we can talk about that too.
I'm especially interested in Nishida Kitarō, and I'm not really sure if I understood your point, but I want to double check here. I think you were saying that there's a point, maybe Nishida Kitarō's major point his major point has to do with a universal nothingness.
I mean, what I was trying to, I was using only his bits of philosophy which can help the process of an I and thou emerging together.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes,
and
I
this universal, it's a kind of technical term which I sort of have not expanded upon here, and I don't even need it for the purposes, for my own purposes.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. Yeah.
'Cause-
What? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I just thought I thought it was sort of like a basis for
Yeah.
kind of overcoming conditions.
Yeah.
Because this is supposed to be universal and unconditioned.
Yeah.
I just thought that was interesting,
Yeah.
along with, I think you mentioned from Nishida, the need to become, if I understood correctly, the need to be, the ability to be able to say, I am myself by not being myself. That's pretty powerful.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a pure paradox.
Yeah.
This, of course, comes from the Zen tradition,
Yeah.
and I think this would be Asokuhi no Ronri
Yeah.
for Nishida Kitarō.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering how difficult that might be to
It
achieve.
is very, yeah.
Especially if we look at Nishida's life.
Yeah.
And the same thing with doubt. You mentioned like this doubt.
Yeah.
So I'm just saying, if this is required
Yeah.
to get to this
Yeah, yeah.
unconditional state, this is not going to be a.
It's not easy, not as he
Yeah.
thought it would for him. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Of course, I mean, but it's the whole idea is to sort of, for the purposes of an intercultural dialogue, I simply found it fascinating to think that the idea that the I and thou meet, and when they meet, they're not basically meeting as two predetermined individuals. What they're doing in this dialogue is basically creating an I and a thou together. Yeah? And for this, one is taking up the role of a host, the other of a guest, and then they sort of alternate. Yeah? And the way I understood this dialogue, it basically means allowing the other person the freedom to be what the other person wants to be, but basically it means emptying oneself of one's own predetermined attributions. It's not an I, it's not confrontative, it's basically mutually supportive. And this is a very, very powerful motive for me in intercultural dialogue.
Yes.
What are you teaching in philosophy, but what kind of classes?
Okay, yeah. Because I do a lot of political philosophy and I also do this stuff on methodology.
Okay.
Yeah.
And from your speech, I think that you have a view of cosmophilosophy,
Yeah.
then rather you can't really separate groups, but it's
Yeah.
a broad.
Okay, so yeah, so I'm a political philosopher. Yes, you suspected correctly.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what I got is like you can separate philosophies in groups,
Yeah.
but every philosophy influences the other.
Yeah.
So can we have like this new term as cosmophilosophy?
I mean, you see, basically we're in Asia, yeah? And Asia is a very good example to show that cultural traditions have always borrowed from each other, right? To just this small bit about where Nishida got this from, you will say, you will have scholars telling you, he got it from Confucianism. The others will tell you, no, it's Taoism. Others will say, no, it's Shintoism. And others will say, no, it was a German influence on him. Yeah, so I guess that's a very good example to show you can't pinpoint, basically. People are synthesizing, making new things new. I would, given my own work on these different traditions, I mean, then call it one cosmophilosophy is slightly difficult. I understand the impetus behind it, and I understand, but to think only one philosophy will do then for the whole of mankind. But I guess it would be unifying, yes. Whatever we are doing there would be unifying, yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is thank you very much. I have a have a very vague question, really. I was wondering if you could say a little more about the concept of community that you use, because many of your examples refer to, say, national or cultural or perhaps linguistic communities.
Yeah.
And then, since you talked about sort of mainstream or dominant philosophy, I was thinking also of the sense of sort of scientific community and particular communities, such as, I don't know, the community of analytical philosophers, of Foucault specialists. So I was wondering if you'd say those are communities in a similar sense.
You're right. I haven't really made a distinction between the communities at play, and there seem to be many different communities. What I took here as a sort of kind of community at a higher level was a liberal state. But of course, such a state is made up of different communities. You're right, and on different levels. Yeah, ethnic communities, linguistic communities, academic communities, professional communities. And basically what I was trying to do was find out that they do seem to interact on different accounts, and they do seem to be separating themselves, isolating themselves too. And in the background, as he rightly saw, there is some other kind of community at work too. Yeah, which is not dividing. It's basically trying to create something new. And the idea is that individuals are moving through these communities and experiencing the fact that they maybe have experiencing phenomenon for which they at one point of time do not necessarily have the conceptual framework to even understand it for themselves. So what do? They borrow. Yeah. They're basically borrowing from the other frameworks at play there. And then through their own experience of such phenomena and the fact that they're borrowing other conceptual frameworks, they are sort of reworking their own community's understanding of a particular framework. That's that whole setup.
I have a maybe basic question. Can you explain to us, maybe give us some specific examples of academic domination? That would count as academic domination, and this wouldn't.
Academic domination would be the way the syllabus is put together. It would be the way budgets are allotted. Yeah. It could be the way we are teaching philosophy students, what philosophy is all about, and what they do at the end. I mean, how much of knowledge have they gathered about, for example, indigenous traditions.
So
right?
if the academic syllabus compiles all the European white masters in philosophy department, that would be the instance of.
Yes, and that is something which is happening everywhere. Yeah. I mean, I see what's being taught in India. What are they learning about Indian? Absolutely nothing. But they will tell you everything about Kant, Husserl, Heidegger.
Yeah.
We would also have this divide. How much of funds are being allotted to research on gender orientation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what would be the solutions to that problem? It's just sort of a general collective self-awareness?
I mean, the first thing is basically, that we don't even look to see where the funds are going.
Right.
We are simply following traditions given to us.
Right.
We are not, I mean, metropolitan societies like Tokyo are highly pluralistic, and we have these societies all over, but what are students learning in these cities and in these countries? They're basically learning what a very, very selective understanding of what philosophy.
For instance, TUJ offers actually these students are here for extra credits for intellectual heritage.
Okay.
It's predominantly white European intellectual texts.
Yeah.
Because this is American university in Japan, so we have a little confusion here. What would you suggest to us?
The American universities themselves are doing a lot on gender. They're doing a lot on other ethnic communities. They're pushing for, I mean, the American Philosophical Association has has 6 or 7 standing committees on diversity.
Right.
And these committees are being nominated. I mean, each committee consists of about 8 or 9 members. They're basically there to see what, how plural or diverse the syllabus is becoming.
Okay. So we're doing better.
Sorry?
So we're doing better than Europeans, basically.
Yeah. I mean, there's a self-awareness there. There's a self-awareness, at least if you take the APA as one example. That maybe we are living in highly pluralistic societies, and we're teaching, we're not making our philosophy students think plurally.
Yeah.
As Matano's poem, that very famous political philosopher says, sadly, we don't make them into global citizens. And when we are done with teaching, we don't know where these people are going, what they're doing, but in today's world, most of them could be assuming highly global responsibilities. And we as philosophy teachers, we are doing nothing to make them aware of their global responsibilities. Because we're simply giving them a very small selective understanding of texts, of what constitutes philosophy, what constitutes meaning making. And the idea then, but it is highly challenging, of course. Yeah? How to then go up developing a syllabus which is inclusive, but it doesn't become so random that students don't know what's happening. So that we're going to take a long time to get there. Yeah.
So globalization doesn't influence like what is studied. It's always a niche that is studied. Always the same people are studying in parts of the world. Like with globalization, for example, there's a fixed list of authors.
Yeah.
And it doesn't change. Even if, like with globalization, here we can see many different things from all over the world.
Yeah.
For example, in the field of philosophy, all the things are the same.
The things are not the same. What we're doing is we're repeating the syllabus.
Okay.
I mean, I have been told many of you are Americans and you're studying in Japan. So you're living now in a very pluralistic environment, probably you're leading a life, the experience I depicted there, that you sort of, in your daily life think, oh gosh, what is happening? And how do I even make it understandable to my own self? Yeah, I presume that such things happen. Yeah? And what is philosophy doing to prepare you for such encounters? Is it doing enough? Or would you say, fine, philosophy is just great. I mean, we are being prepared very well. I don't, maybe some of you can talk about your own experiences, but whatever I see, it's not. My students tell me no. Yeah?
As a student, so as you talk about the difference between the philosophical traditions around the globe, but I want to ask you, for you as a professor, what is the key for us, for at least like a student, to understand philosophical traditions around the world? What do you think is the key for us to understand the difference between all the traditions?
The difference, we'll have to then sort of spend time on the individual traditions. No? And the first problem then is, what do we count as a philosophical traditions, what do we not? Yeah, because in the history of philosophy, there's been a very strong exclusion. That's where the first problem begins. And then we'll have to slowly begin then, even take, for example, Hinduism, Indian philosophy. Indian philosophy has had a very selective representation of its own self. Even these categories, once you open them up, they're going to be very messy. We will then have to sort of work out with what do we want to include in that tradition, and this work is happening. It's not to be It's not something which we will do in the next 100 years. It's already happening. And how to then, in a second step, begin preparing it for students. And in the third step, then working out their differences. But also the similarities, I guess. No? Yeah.
So maybe, I'm not sure, but maybe with these two students here, maybe the question here is if we have plurality,
Yeah.
and we're talking about plurality, what would be the unifying or singular basis
Yeah.
from which we make the judge? There has to be, someone mentioned cosmic, I think, like something,
Yeah.
even if it's an ideal,
Yeah.
some sense, even if it's something that we haven't achieved,
Yeah.
some understanding that there is some kind of like truth with a capital T that somehow guides us in making these determinations,
Yeah.
how to make these judgments. And then if someone's going to tell me what my syllabus has to be, that's got to be based on
Yeah.
some judgment, and it's someone's telling me.
Yeah.
It's not this person, it's who's that person going to tell me?
Yeah, so these
So-
are knowledge communities, and these are, they would have to be configured differently as today, but you're right. And at one point of time, we would then have to make judgments, yeah, and say this is philosophy, this is not. But I guess that we would also have to allow for the fact that these definitions themselves are not, they're contingent, right? And what is the unifying factor which then makes philosophies into a kind of, the umbrella term, as I said, meaning making. Humans trying to understand their place in the world. And in most of these traditions, whether indigenous or not, they are somehow relating to reality, what they perceive to be reality. A lot has been happening in Australia and New Zealand with indigenous philosophies, and also in places like America, about indigenous traditions which have we completely excluded from the syllabus and from the understanding of philosophy, and now being, I don't want to say included, because in my paper I said it's not enough, but basically being included within the domain of philosophy. Yeah.
I would like to give a brief comment just about one question you raised earlier. You said, what is philosophy doing enough
Yeah.
for the student, and what is philosophy actually doing
Yeah.
for the student? Myself, with my colleagues here, I guess we will agree, as an educator, one thing that philosophy, being a dominant discourse or not, what is doing
Yeah.
is enabling them to think critically.
Yeah.
Even though it might sound really
Yeah.
obvious,
Yeah.
I think that's something really, really important.
Yeah.
And then this epistemic dependence that you brought upon as a subject, I think that's something that at least my students in my class we're analyzing and
Yeah.
trying to break down
Good.
through those clouds of epistemic dependence through various discourses. Even my point would be all this intellectual decolonization that you're trying
Yeah.
to advocate here, which I'm not against. It seems that it is not something that exists only between indigenous nations and dominant
No, no,
nations
no,
or
no.
discourses, but
Yeah.
it's not only between philosophy or and other instances, like as you say, different qualifiers. You have dominant Euro-American philosophy,
Yeah.
and then Asian, Hindu,
Yeah.
or whatever philosophy there might be. But it seems to me that it's rather a thing between a dominant discourse
Yeah.
and a discourse that's challenging
Okay.
a dominant discourse. In this sense, it can be within the Euro-American
Of course.
tradition as well.
Yeah.
Every philosophical idea or
Yeah.
movement that has emerged
Yeah.
has been challenged
Yeah.
in the same way,
Yeah.
so to speak. So what I see here is that rather these other cultures are trying to find a place or claim a space, so to speak, in this world tradition of philosophies that we're
Yeah.
trying to establish here. But I think the point shouldn't be put on so much on the those qualifiers or ethnicities or nationalities, but it should be dominant discourses against those who are minority or those who are being suppressed or don't have a voice, so to speak. So how do we allow those who are minority to allow them to have a voice or to have their own narrative put out there as well, and being valued in the same way as one discourse that's been well entrenched, dominant for a long time, which actually defines how the game is played, so to speak, right? So what do you think about that? Is it just intellectual decolonization? I agree, but in a sense that rather it be intellectual deconstruction or something. I'm not sure.
But I mean, you're basically making my point stronger. And taking the example of Indian tradition, which I mentioned earlier, the Indian tradition has been very, very exclusive itself, that which is taken as Indian philosophy. And you'll find the same exclusionary mechanisms at work even there. I mean, I'm just doing this here because of the syllabus which is happening all around the world. But if you take Indian philosophy itself and what it excludes, you will find the same mechanism at work. And intellectual decolonization, that it is probably too political a term, is that what you're trying to say?
Perhaps, yeah.
Could be, But it is something which is applicable, I guess, to everybody, not only to people who colonized, but also to those who were colonized, because they are repeating the mechanisms themselves. They've internalized them and they're repeating them themselves. Deconstruction,
I mean, it can be another word in a sense, but I think it's challenging those dominant, well-entrenched, time-honored discourses. The dominant science, philosophy, and religion, and so on, that need to be put in check here, right?
A lot of work is also happening, similar work, similar to what I projected here, is happening in the philosophy of gender, of course. And that's where this whole thing is coming from. Right, as he said, the white males are being attacked because, the feminist theorists have to large extent laid the ground there. Because what these people are attacking, all of them, is also the kind of epistemology at work there. The transcendental viewpoint of a few people claiming to have knowledge and then universalizing it. Right, so there's a lot of hidden social epistemology doing work in the background. Most of the critics also underscore the fact that academic philosophy worldwide is a highly male-dominated discipline. At least in America and in North America and in Europe, the female philosophers are underrepresented, and philosophy is comparable to, in that respect, with engineering and the other STEM faculties. This is also one of the reasons, and their critique goes along the same lines. It's not only exclusionary and monolithic because it is excluding other cultural traditions, it's also excluding other. It's basically, one gender is at play there.
Can you, for instance, teach feminist philosophy in University of Konstanz?
In Germany, feminist theory is not, you can do it in cultural studies. But I do it in my class, I do bits. I do, then I offer a course on personhood, and then I do both. Because my students tell me that, as I said, that they're not being prepared for many of them also will become teachers of philosophy later on in the high school, and say that philosophy courses are not preparing them for life out there. There's nothing happening on multiculturalism, for example. Not part of the philosophical syllabus.
Can we do it at TUJ?
Just to continue the discussion, I think I understand the point that you're making, that you can have these dominant positions that have lasted for a long time, and it could be that they've dominated simply because of power, but it could be they've dominated because they have depth. And just opening up to anybody who has not had a chance to speak and let them speak, I'm saying that's fine, but that doesn't mean that every position has the same depth, or that every position has the same, is equal philosophically. There could be some people that are deeper than others, or some positions that are deeper than others. So I'm just thinking that it's good to open up to a variety of different positions or discourses, if you will, but there still has to be some basis on making judgments, some kind of universal basis. Just like I would think we have to have some notion that we're opening up to different kinds of human beings because we have this underlying understanding that the person is equal. We are all equal as persons in this. Now, some people might deny that, but that as a person, regardless of gender, as a person, that we're all, that we are all equal, whatever it means to be a person. So the same thing for determining notions of truth in philosophy. We have to assume that there is some underlying truth. It can't just all be contingent or just discourse. Otherwise, how can we make judgments on what to choose for the syllabus, for example?
But I think many studies, I'm familiar with the Indian tradition, and many studies on Indian philosophy show that the Indian philosophical traditions have been highly sophisticated traditions in their development of logic. And this understanding of logic does not always mirror the logic understood by the Western tradition. So what do you do there? Do you say it's inferior because we know we have depth and the others don't? Or, as you say, we'll have to simply open up and we'll have to dialogue with them on what it is, before then deciding, okay, it doesn't fit the bill. But what is happening so far is we're not even talking with each other, right? To even understand the differences. Because the case-based logic of Indian philosophical schools doesn't really fit the patterns found in the Euro-American tradition. What do we do with that? Is it then inferior because it's different? I mean, those are, you know. And I do understand your problem of relativism. That we then be opening up the field, and then everybody would want to then claim they have a particular philosophy of their own. This is an understandable concern, but what I'm trying to say is we simply have to begin talking with each other. Yeah.
The problem is when we're in a certain position, so to speak, in a superior position to others, this doesn't enable dialogue.
Yeah.
So that's why we refute automatically from position of being superior to something else, so to speak, doesn't really enable, there's no position, that's why equality is, as you've mentioned, it's really important. So we have to level the field, not in terms of relativizing views and notions, but in terms of giving equal chance at least to prove a point.
Yeah.
And then, as Monika says, we'll see how it works out, where it leads. So at least, but I agree, we cannot take up anyone's view as
Yeah, I mean, because I think like internet or something, there are just so, like we're talking about news today, so many.
Yeah, yeah, of course,
perspectives
of course.
To the point where,
Yeah.
what's the truth?
Yeah, yeah.
And everyone is equalized.
Yeah.
Where's the keeper that's going to decide what has quality and what doesn't?
Yeah.
I just want to.
Yeah.
I understand your point.
Yeah.
But I just want to say
Yeah.
that
And it's right, and it is a concern. And it is a concern in one respect because it's also cutting away at meaning making. This is a very exclusionary understanding of meaning making when you keep on saying, oh, that was fake news. Because it's somebody, then some communities are using their power to sort of, claim what is authentic and what's not in terms of news, which is, and as you say, if every individual is a equal human being, then we have to give them a fair hearing, which is not happening in today's political context.
Well, I guess on that note, we'll have to end today's lecture. We've spoken about transformative dialogue in Nishida, which I hope and everyone will go home a little bit transformed from this lecture. I thank you all for coming today on this hot Saturday afternoon, and I hope you enjoyed the talk. Feel free to stay a little bit and discuss further with Monika if you wish to ask further questions. And please come next time for next time.